Hello, Professor. So Israel is pressing ahead with its plans for a ground attack on Rafah despite the U.S. halting arms supplies. How do you evaluate the current relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
Well, first, Joe Biden has said many times that U.S. support for Israel is ironclad. The reports I've read indicate the White House has decided that U.S. weapons might have been used illegally against international law, but it's not clear. Perhaps they were made elsewhere. Therefore, I think we're going to understand the White House is saying it will not stop providing weapons to Israel despite the atrocities. We must ask, if the right hand kills, is the left hand innocent? And let's be clear, despite reports the U.S. has paused or slowed the flow of some of its most deadly bombs to Israel with concern that they might be used in a full-scale invasion of Rafah, we have no independent means to assess how many weapons Israel already has on hand and whether this is just a sleight of hand on Biden's part to avoid taking more responsibility for a war that he's already paying for dearly in the polls. In the meantime, as we see the attacks on Rafah are intensifying. Second, the U.S. has accommodated Israel oppressing and killing Palestinians for decades. The current atrocities in Gaza are horrifying in their intensity and scale. By some estimates, more than 50,000 killed. But how many have been killed or suffered shortened lives over the past 75 years? We don't have reliable figures, but estimates range from the hundreds of thousands to millions. Nevertheless, the U.S. has long given billions in military aid to Israel annually and provided advanced weapons. And Israel has long violated international law and human rights. And despite Israel's crimes against humanity, despite most countries in the world opposing such policies, the U.S. has consistently armed Israel and protected Zionism, not only in the UN, but also by threatening the International Criminal Court, as a group of powerful U.S. senators did explicitly last week in a signed open letter. And third, we must focus on the war on terror, and we must point the finger likewise at Washington. But we must also point out the deadly double standards and human rights hypocrisy promoted by the U.S. We should not be distracted from what's simultaneously happening in the West Bank, where Israel is now expanding illegal occupations and killing Palestinians there, also contrary to international law and likewise the will of the United Nations. Meanwhile, Blinken wags a finger at Beijing and suggests some of China's trade with Russia is directly supporting Moscow's campaign in Ukraine. Why does anyone listen to Washington? Is it because power grows out of the barrel of a gun? Is it because people would rather eat with Washington instead of being eaten, as Blinken has also warned?
Yeah, well, the UN General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly in favor of reviving Palestine's bid for full membership, but the Israel envoy has denounced the resolution. Let's take a listen first.
This is your mirror, so that you can see exactly what you are inflicting upon the UN Charter with this destructive vote. This is you are shredding the UN Charter with your own hands. Yes, that's what you're doing, shredding the UN Charter.
It is so insulting to all of us, to the UN and to the Charter. And those who behave in this manner are pushing the patience of the membership of the United Nations.
Well, Professor, what do you make of the Israeli envoy's remarks?
Well, Israel is waging an illegal war against Palestine, but we might also say that it's waging a war against the United Nations. Israel has repeatedly been condemned by the UN and has repeatedly condemned the UN, and yet nothing has changed. Israel has nuclear weapons and should be a member of the UN, but it should also be understood perhaps as a rogue state when it comes to the Palestinian issue, an issue which unfortunately is central to Israel's existence. Now, the UN has tried to find a middle ground, tried to promote the two-state solution as a means of coexistence, but it seems that Israel continues to pursue a path of destruction and occupation. Now, is this because the destruction of Palestine is foundational to Zionism, or because Israel's own crises and domestic governance require a foe that can be used to promote periodic unity governments and therefore preserve the Israeli state? Perhaps both reasons are true. But the fact is the UN has struggled to advance peace and development given the rise of U.S. Unilateralism after the collapse of the USSR, a point that became very clear when the U.S. lied to the UN Security Council to justify its illegal invasion of Iraq after 9/11. And the UN is struggling now because the U.S. is trenchantly opposed to multilateralism, and the U.S. is absolutely opposed to the UN holding Israel accountable. So, in fact, the UN Charter is being shredded by the U.S. and Israel and anyone else who ignores the will of the international community, above all by killing other people.
Yeah, very ironic. Well, evacuation orders were issued for Rafah residents as fuel in the city runs low. How do you assess the current humanitarian situation in southern Gaza?
Well, last week, there was some optimism that a truce might be reached and a full-scale invasion of Rafah averted. Now, reports from Hamas indicate those efforts appear to have collapsed back to square one. The U.S. says a truce is still possible, and there seems to be some pressure from the White House aimed at stopping Israel from hitting Rafah harder. Meanwhile, it seems a full-scale invasion is in fact already coming. Now, we must not allow ourselves to think that tragedy has not already come to Rafah. If a man shoots your wife and starves your daughter, should you feel relieved? If your grandparents are bombed because they're unable to respond to evacuation orders, then who's to blame? In fact, we hear report after report that the situation in Rafah is already horrific, that it's already getting worse, that Israel is intensifying strikes and choking the city to death, preventing humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, we worry whether something worse is coming and whether that worse can be stopped. This worry is misleading. Rafah is already hell on earth.
Thank you so much for insights, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, professor of politics at East China Normal University.